First of all, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Great to be here.
You know, let's clarify a mistake that I think a lot of people make when I tell them that I'm going to talk to you. They say, "Oh, you know, he's David Brinkley's son."
Not David Brinkley's son, no relation whatsoever, although I admired him a great deal as a broadcaster, but no connection.
So, I'm so fascinated by the topics that you're always examining when it comes to contemporary history. What you've done with the President Carter, the unfinished presidency, that sort of thing. How do you think, when you're looking at history, is it fair for us to believe that people are going to look at these major figures the same way 50 years from now as we look at them today?
Well, it depends on which figure. The key to history is to remember that our times are not uniquely oppressive and things aren't maybe as spectacular and big as we think when we turn on the nightly news. Everybody right now, if I ask most viewers, tell me something about Grover Cleveland, a two-term president, they wouldn't know one thing about him. So what makes you think of Bill Clinton or somebody like George W. Bush is going to be remembered that much 100 or 200 years from now? People remember that George W. Bush was president during 9/11. Bill Clinton, they may remember the impeachment problem, and then people kind of forget. What I try to look at is write about people's legacies that are sustainable. For example, I've written about Neil Armstrong and got to go interview him. And Rosa Parks, I was her biographer. I knew Armstrong and Parks were two people that 500 years from now, everybody was going to know their story, because being the first man on the moon or the woman who launched the modern civil rights movement, we're going to be taught and studied. So it's not always politicians that translate out of our time. They gobble up a lot of the headlines and the news stories right now, but only a few that do big things, the way Ronald Reagan was president for the end of the Cold War and has a concrete accomplishment, or Lyndon Johnson with the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, or Kennedy because of his flamboyant speaking style and carrying us through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of those presidents have this memorableness to them, but most U.S. senators and congressmen of today, people don't remember 100, 200 years from now.
Is that I always call that term like a generational arrogance, this belief that nothing really mattered except what happened to us. But is that true of every generation, or is it just us?
I think it's true of every generation, and there's just this automatic, this is the worst, the biggest, the most horrific. I mean, I wrote a book, The Great Deluge, on Hurricane Katrina, and how awful it was. And I'm watching on the news now, that was for death, which is the highest of toll of a disaster. I mean, we're dealing with, 2,000 deaths. Mm-hmm. And on the news, as a ticker type item, there's 20,000 people now, killed.
In Myanmar?
Yeah, and it's just like, wow. I mean, 20,000 people, and yet I can go find you history. Typhoons come and go, people die, people come back. There's a it's one of the things that the more I study history, the more I realize how important you have to tie in not just to individuals or legislation, but to general sweeps of things. I'm writing right now about Theodore Roosevelt's foresight in creating our modern national park system and forest and monuments. Theodore Roosevelt put aside 230 million acres. Imagine without Yellowstone or Yosemite, this country, or without Key West or Crater Lake, or he repopulated the buffalo herds, and he gave us this sort of wilderness grid, which our country now can be so proud of, although we're not maintaining it properly. But, and that's a huge accomplishment. So you try to decipher what's really big and important. Yet when Roosevelt was doing that, it wasn't the headlines in the New York Times. Not Roosevelt putting aside, this, it became back news little items. Sometimes the big story, or maybe the big story in Texas right now is this border fence going up. Maybe 100 years from now, people say, what were they thinking of building this fence? And here they spent the Cold War ripping down the Berlin Wall. Now they're trying to fence in the Texas border in this hodgepodge style. Yet today it's never a big front page story. It's sort of a trickle on the back pages. So you try to decipher what's going to resonate in a large way down the line.
When you're looking at history, do you give I imagine it's not easy to tell the things we're going to remember right away. So is it a 50-year test, a 100-year test, or what are the event? When we, for example, you mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of my favorite presidents to read about, and who I think most people don't have a clue to how different this man really was. But he's made this test, I think, passed this test, and we look at him differently when you read about him.
You do. And look, people didn't know Martin Luther King, when he was shot in Memphis, people didn't realize there was going to be a Martin Luther King Day, or that he was going to live on in the way that he was. In fact, King's movement was starting to peter out quite a bit at the time in Memphis. He was struggling a lot to find traction. So, you know, his legacy now is undeniable. It will go on and on forever. Take a figure like Barack Obama right now. If Obama doesn't get the nomination for the Democratic Party and gets mired in some negative, stories, he'll be just seen as a good try politician, but nothing all that spectacular. But if he became president, everywhere he made a speech, there'll be a plaque someday, Barack Obama spoke here, because he's that good of orator, and his speeches are starting to become famous, but without the power, they just become speeches. But if he becomes president, suddenly wherever he spoke has a new connotation. If he was here in an auditorium in SMU, people remember Barack Obama spoke here.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a big difference between winning and losing. I mean, there aren't presidential libraries. SMU's building one for George W. Bush, but there aren't presidential libraries for people that didn't become president. They're not, people aren't building a legacy for Michael Dukakis.
Yeah.
So it's winning in politics is very key.
I wanted to, just a couple more questions. The way you started teaching history with the magic bus, which I think some people know about, a lot of people don't know about, actually going with students to these locations and saying, you know what, forget about it. We're going to read the books, but we're also going to try to examine what this was in the environment. You think that's important for all of us to try to do?
My mom and dad were high school teachers, and I used to spend my summers in a trailer going across the country, but they would take me to the Truman Library of Independence, or we'd go read Willa Cather, Nebraska, or go to John Steinbeck's Salinas. By the end of it all, I mean, as a kid, I'd been to the lower 48, and now when I became a history professor, I realized most of my students were very parochial. I was teaching in New York at the time, and I thought, well, let's kind of try to get this movement, of getting excited about history. Nothing bothers me more than to be people that think that history is boring, because wherever I go, I want to know the history of everything. A neighborhood that I'm in, what's going on, when is this building bought, and things that today you can't imagine. Already now, the first McDonald's and the first Wendy's are becoming historic sites. 200 years from now, the first McDonald's may be considered, almost a historic site, yet today it's just part of our franchise, America. So a lot is about what's going to survive and what kind of local groups, do things. But I believe in getting out there and seeing America. I mean, it's one thing to read about the Gettysburg battlefield. It's another thing to go to Gettysburg.
Douglas, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Look forward.